From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to the HPS Insights podcast and our special series on higher education. I'm Stacy Kerr, former Chief Communications Officer at Georgetown University, a partner here at HPS, part of our education team, and I'm joined by my HPS colleagues, Matt McDonald and Elliott Owensby. Hi, guys.
Hi, Stacy.
Hello.
We're back on the pod.
Glad to be here.
Great. Well, together we recently authored a paper looking at the economics of higher ed at this most unprecedented and really for this sector, uncertain time. And we've been talking about the challenges the sector faces in this special HPS Insights series. Today, on this episode, we're going to be joined by Dr. Debbie Cottrell, the president of Texas Lutheran University, and get her perspective and talk about the challenges facing small private colleges and universities. But Elliott, let's remind folks what our analysis found as it relates to private universities.
Yeah, it's interesting when the headlines are often focused around the cost of college. When we looked at the net price or the kind of true cost of college, generally what we found was that on a compound annual basis, cost increases at private universities are generally below the rate of inflation. So in many cases, you see a cost increasing at 1% a year, where inflation may be above 2%. So it certainly paints a different story in terms of the cost and the true cost than what we often see in the media coverage. Yeah,
that was really the biggest surprise that I found. Matt, what's surprised you most about the current environment?
Well, for me, it has this quality of watching, like many things that we're seeing, is just watching a disconnect between kind of sometimes broad public understanding and then the underlying realities of the situation, in this case for higher education, and that's whatever kind of the breakdown in understanding or breakdown in communications is, that just makes it more difficult for everyone collectively as a society to kind of address the current crisis. It becomes a challenge when people don't have an understanding of the reality of the situation or what any institution may or may not be dealing with.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out with the stakeholders that a university president deals with, and if she's seeing the same thing. So let's discuss and get some perspective on small privates and how they're navigating the future. We're joined here by the president of Texas Lutheran University, Dr. Debbie Cottrell. TLU is an undergraduate university serving about 1,300 students, nearly all of whom receive federal financial aid. A native Texan, Dr. Cottrell's an American historian with a focus on women's history and education. She began her teaching career as a professor and assistant dean of the faculty at Cottrell College, a women's college, and moved into higher ed administration full-time with roles as associate dean of the faculty and director of graduate programs at Smith College and provost at William Peace College down in North Carolina, before being named the president of TLU in July of last year, which means she had approximately 6 months to settle in as president before a global pandemic, an economic crisis, and social and racial unrest took hold over an intense 4-month period. President Cottrell, with all that and everything going on in the world, thank you so much for taking time to join us on HPS Insights. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Great opportunity to be here. Really happy I can participate in this conversation, and I thank you all for having it.
Thanks. Well, I will add, personally, I've known and followed Dr. Cottrell for many years. In fact, she was my first college professor. President Cottrell, I'm remembering we traveled together to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, my freshman year of college, to see former Senator Bill Bradley speak. And I think that night I told you that if he ever ran for president, I would work for him, which I then did 4 years later. And I look back and trace my personal and professional interest in women's leadership to our discussions in your classroom. And then, of course, you gave me helpful and wise guidance and context as I jumped in to the higher ed sector when I transitioned from Capitol Hill into the senior leadership at Georgetown. So what a pleasure it is to come to this conversation together today, really at a time probably neither one of us could have predicted. I want to just jump in and set some context for this discussion. Your background is working at small privates, and that's what we're going to focus on today. But tell us a little bit about Texas Lutheran.
I think anytime you're trying to understand an institution, there are several key characteristics that it helps to know, starting with size. You already mentioned we're 1,400 students have been in that range for a while. Our location, I think, is an important part of our story. We would say we're in a rural area located in Seguin, Texas. At the same time, though, we're just about 30 miles to the east of San Antonio. So we have good access to large metropolitan area. And I think also a very important thing that your listeners would note is that we're in a growth area. We're in a part of the country where demographics right now for a while have been, and the trends suggest will be for a while, in our favor. Population growing, the young population growing, university and college population growing all around us. I think another really key aspect of Texas Lutheran is our diversity. And this might also go, as Matt was talking about, sometimes the surprises about private institutions. I think another surprise for people sometimes is how diverse we can be. That, of course, has been a change over time historically. But at TLU today, we serve approximately 40% of a student population that is Hispanic, 10 to 12% Black. So we do consider ourselves a minority serving institution and an institution that is a majority minority. That has changed some over time, but we have throughout our history, we're more diverse than we have been, but we are throughout our history, we have been a diverse institution. We also have a very high population of first-generation college students. That is definitely a big part of the institution that we are. And as you said, virtually all of our students are on financial aid. And then along with that, and not necessarily last, we are a faith-based institution. So we have a tie to the Lutheran Church. It's, faith-based institutions do this in different ways. Ours is not, it has no financial support and no sort of other commitment that people make to the Lutheran institution, but we are part of a group of Lutheran colleges and universities across the country that have a history, connection, and an ongoing relationship with the Lutheran Church.
So you're a university president, but you're also a trained American historian, and you're a professor of history. So I wonder if you can share how this current moment is being felt on your campus.
Yeah, Stacy, it's a complicated moment. I mean, on the one hand, I look out and we're a completely empty campus, and we have been since mid-March. At the same time, we're a very busy campus, trying to do all the things that have to be done right now, most of them unprecedented. I would say in this exact moment, this is a campus, no matter where our population is, that is in some pain. I would say there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, though, I would say as a community, there's a lot of resiliency and a lot of desire for the community to stay whole in all the ways that means now, and to find our footing at this really unusual
mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And when you talk about the community, you mean the larger community around you. I saw you had an op-ed, I think, in your local paper over the weekend, sort of inviting the community into the conversations that you all are having and sort of the unique, I think, things that a university can provide.
Right, yes. When I talk about community, first I think of our TLU community, faculty, staff, students, alums, regents, all of that. But then immediately from there connect it, yes, to the community that surrounds us, absolutely.
And have you announced plans for the fall, or what are your plans for the fall, and what's driving those calculations? And especially, I would say that's probably changing, right, in Texas. I mean, we're seeing this week maybe a rise in the hospital visits, and I wonder how that's affecting how you make decisions.
Yes, currently in Texas, a rise in hospitalizations and cases, so we're having to watch that very carefully. Our working plan right now is to reopen and to do that with whatever rearrangements we need to make to ensure safety for our students. And to think through, we've got work teams working on all the logistics. The calculations for us are just what you said, what's going on around us, state, local, region. We're following the same guidelines that most institutions are, CDC, American College Health Association, what the state is doing. And at the end of all of that is not only the safety, which of course is first and foremost, but how are we going to give our students a quality experience, the things that they want and expect. And you know that what we take a lot of pride in is being a small community that spends time together. So how do we navigate through that at a time like this? But that's what we're working towards. That's the calculations we're trying to sort out.
I'm curious on the return. I've seen a number of universities pulling forward timelines, trying to solve against Thanksgiving, that type of thing. Do you have do a lot of your students, are their kind of families or bases local, or do you draw more broadly across Texas or the country? How are you thinking about some of those time shift options that we've seen in other universities' contexts?
So we are primarily a Texas institution, drawing largely from the region with a little bit of mix added to that. So your question is right on in the sense that then what does that mean? We have a population that goes home quite a bit because they can. So stopping early might help us, but it's not going to help us in the same way. It's not going to have an impact in the same way that it would if your population is coming from all over the country and you know that Thanksgiving is this huge time of departure, different from all the rest. So that actually, we were just talking about that this morning in our planning group. How do we evaluate that? There could still be some advantages to that. But it's not as cut and dry for us, which to me is a huge part of this whole story of what's happening right now. All institutions, it's so locally and regionally driven. A college in New Hampshire may have a beautiful plan that just simply would not work here because the situation is very different.
Yeah, one thing that I found as even a surprise coming from a background of multiple stakeholders and is just how many stakeholders there are for universities to manage and for university presidents to manage. And I wonder if you can just share a little bit about that. You have your board of trustees, you have your students, you've mentioned the faculty and staff, and just who are those stakeholders? It's something we think a lot about as communications professionals. And how do you do that delicate dance of keeping them all in balance?
So it's all those groups you just named. I think you didn't say alums. That's another big stakeholder group, and your local community, I would say, is also stakeholders. I try to keep in mind that that can be challenging because, first of all, those groups are not singular entities all in agreement thinking about things the same way. So you've got groups with differing perspectives, and within those groups you've got differing perspectives.
Right.
But in a healthy way, what I try to keep in mind is usually these groups are all very invested in the university. They believe in the place, they have some connection to the place that makes them have hope and see potential. And so as a college president, what you get is the advantage of all those perspectives to help you think about what you need to do. Sure, it can be kind of hard because those perspectives sometimes are in conflict and you have to figure out what you're going to do about that. But just in any sort of fact-finding mission, the more information you have, the better you can act. And so I view the stakeholders as being very helpful in determining how the university is going to move forward. But you also have to know this is not about having everybody either see things the same way or be happy with what's going on at the university.
Right, absolutely. And share with us a little, just how has this changed having a global pandemic and now the economic fallout and the reckoning around Black Lives Matter? How has this changed your priorities over the last 4 months? And do you spend more time with certain stakeholders?
Let me say first, I think what has happened in the last several months is that my priorities have been streamlined and focused. Mm-hmm. There is no question that right now what I have to do is think really about a couple of things every day, all day. And one of those things is addressing the pain and the fear that's throughout our community, certainly with our Black community. That's just a very real and tangible issue, and they need to know that this university is here for them. Along with that, I have to make sure that we can reopen safely in the fall. And those really are the two priorities that I have right now. If it was a different moment, those things would still be priorities, but there would be just a lot more going on and a lot more competing for my time and all of that. But really what's happened in these last several months is just a streamlining and honing in on that and having the community really be with me in that. I think people understand that. I don't know that it means I've changed how much time I spend with stakeholders, certainly changed how I spend time with stakeholders. But I think probably all of those groups that are so important remain critical at this time, and communicating with them has remained.
Mm-hmm.
Really
and you mentioned the anxiety certainly of the Black students. Is there economic anxiety among your population about how they will return? I mean, I just saw this morning, a new survey out from Strata with, again, more disparities and a disproportionate impact of people of color changing their plans based on the pandemic and the economic fallout, and specifically Latinos changing plans at double the rate of white Americans. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, with your specific population at Texas Lutheran, are you feeling that yet? Are you seeing that?
I would say we're not seeing it yet, but we're anticipating it. Because we think the economic situation is still changing so much that we've probably got some students and their families who have a very strong desire to return, but just may not be able to. And they haven't yet acted on that. We're doing everything we can to minimize the risk of that, but it's going to be difficult. I will say there's no question that the federal stimulus money was particularly helpful to us in that regard, in part because, as you know, that the first tranche that came through from the federal government had to go to students. And I really applaud and support that before any money could go to support the institution's budgetary challenges, we had to provide funds to our students who were particularly impacted by the pandemic. And so we've had an ongoing process of getting funding to our students specialized to this time. And that has really made a difference. And I think it will continue to make a difference. The question is, will it be enough?
Yeah, and Dr. Cottrell, I wanted to ask you about that in particular as it relates to the CARES Act and future efforts, in terms of relief. I think there seems to be some appetite on Capitol Hill and within the administration to work on another package that may have some support. What would you say from your perspective, what are those priorities for, the institution, for the community you're serving, for all of those stakeholders? Are there specific priorities that DC and Washington should be aware of as they're moving forward with hopefully this next tranche of relief?
I think first and foremost, funds that go to our students would be the top priority, because if you take this back to where we started and the idea that private institutions may well be within the reach of students, even if that's not what's commonly known, this is where federal financial aid can make a big difference. If we say that we want accessibility and we want any student to have a choice of where they go, regardless of their background, we want the choice to be there. It's going to take federal funds to continue to make that possible. They, as I say, they've already helped, and not just in this most recent moment, but that is a big part of it. And then, there are other, at this time, I do think we're all facing some challenges around expenses due to the pandemic and what we're going to need to do to reopen. So I do think funds in that regard would also be very helpful. And there are equalization funds that most states have. We have here what's called the TEG, Texas Equalization Grant, and those are designed specifically to give funds to students who attend private institutions, with the thought that at the end of the day, that gives more choice, and it also takes some pressure off of the public institutions who really could not serve all of our students in this state if it all had to happen through the publics, or it would cost more money for them. And that's a great thing. It is a great thing, but there are never enough funds in the equalization buckets. And so more in that regard too. Federal, if I was making my wish list, if you could relay this.
That's why we're here.
in more infusion into equalization funds would be huge for us.
Well, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into pricing, more on pricing and financing, and some of the ways that small regional privates fit into or don't fit into the national conversation around higher ed. You're listening to HPS Insights series on higher education.
You're listening to HPS Insights, a regular podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies. Be sure to subscribe to hear the latest from the HPS team on policy debates affecting the business and political communities.
We're back on HPS Insights, talking to Dr. Debbie Cottrell, president of Texas Lutheran. I want to shift more to pricing. Dr. Cottrell, you've mentioned that higher ed is unique in that most schools rely on infusions of capital twice a year with tuition. Is that adding even more pressure to this moment?
I would say it is, because there are even more unknowns in this moment than we usually have. Typically in the summer, you're managing melt. You're looking for who you might lose that you thought you were going to have, but it's within a fairly small range of percentage points. This summer, there are just so many more factors, particularly economic factors, that it's much harder to gauge what's going to happen. And as you said, we are tuition driven. And so the primary source of revenue for us is tuition. And so to the extent that that changes our financial picture.
And so tell me what's your perspective? You heard in our intro, we found that the net price for private 4 years actually rose slower than inflation over the last 20 years. What's your perspective on the cost of higher ed broadly? And do you think that there is a looming crisis on pricing?
Well, first, I think what Matt said earlier is right. There's a lot of misunderstanding and misperception about how higher ed pricing works. And some of that is because it's fairly complicated. If you look at higher ed budgets in general, if you took the financial aid component out, it's a pretty simple picture. You have certain revenues, you have certain expenses, you try to have those balance out. But where it gets really complicated is when you start factoring in financial aid. The sources of that aid, who's going to get that aid, how that aid's going to be applied. Any institution is getting aid from the government, they're getting aid from donors, and then they're providing some of their own aid. And then think about it also, you're offering money out to students to get them to come to your institution. And so you're offering a package, as we call it. And how your ultimate revenue picture is going to look is not based just on how many of those students take your package, but which of those students take your package and what their need is. And so you may think, well, we have this many packages out on the street, and if X% come, then this is what our picture looks like. But it's much more complicated than that. So I do think that the model is a difficult one, and it certainly received a lot of criticisms because this model of you set a price, you back out financial aid, and then that's what the families pay. It's not really efficient. It's not always fair. And it leads to a lot of misconceptions around what happens. But we also know that families like getting scholarships, families like receiving aid. So those schools that have experimented with, well, let's make it simple and not do that, have not always had the results that they wanted, because there is still something about this model that seems in some ways to be appealing to families. I don't think the cost of doing business is the problem necessarily. I mean, I think most people understand that if you're going to run a business, an institution, an organization, there are going to be costs. But I think it's more in where the breakdown comes is how people understand the aid and the offset to price and all of the things that come around that. Does that mean we have a crisis coming? Well, maybe, but I think there's been discussion of a crisis for a long time. That doesn't mean it won't come, but I think people have known for a long time that this model is not necessarily the best model, but it's the model that has continued to be supported in one way or another.
Have you seen changes in the way that students or families engage in the shopping application process in terms of how they think about the opportunity for aid, how they think about the sticker price. I mean, part of what we've been thinking about is the degree to which the dimension on, say, the policy of higher education or the public kind of imagination about it has fixated on the sticker price. It's not clear to me that at a student or family level that people aren't aware of kind of the bargaining that's available, or at least some aren't aware. How have you seen behaviors change on that front, and how have you as an institution adapted to that?
So I'd say across my career, I've certainly seen an increase in savviness and a recognition that what one institution may be offering can be used when talking to another institution. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that's families trying to understand the complexity of the situation. And sometimes it's also just around, well, if you don't ask, you're not going to get something. So why not go ahead and put it out there, even if ultimately you don't get it? So I've definitely seen an increase in that. I think in the last, I would say that since I've been here, the last 8 years, it's probably been more of the same, with maybe a little bit more momentum behind the idea that, well, sticker price is way too high. So, how do we get this to a place that's affordable? But I also, we work with a lot of families for whom getting to college is very, very important. And so I think that and not taken for granted. And so the conversation for us is always, I think where we try to start is, how can we make this happen? Is this something that can happen, and what will it take? Partnering with this family for their students to come to college. Again, and remind you, we have a lot of students they're the first in their family to go to college. And so there's, I think, a real desire to make sure that they understand the process and that they can achieve the goal of going to college.
Along those lines, Dr. Cottrell, in terms of institutional finance and potential resources, one other piece that we looked at in our analysis was the role of endowments. And, another thing that's in the headlines, certainly, that where we think the reality probably doesn't match some of the more sensational coverage. And there's even great disparities in how universities with large endowments, mechanically leverage those funds versus the role that smaller institutions have with their resources. Can you tell us a little bit about how TLU thinks about the endowment and the role that plays in institutional resources and in resources for students, recognizing that it's a complicated and I think misunderstood debate.
So we have at TLU, we have what I will describe as a modest endowment. We have about an $80 million endowment. So it's not nothing, but it's not near as large as some of the institutions in other parts of the country, and some of I know the folks you all have talked to, it's at a very different scale. But for a small institution like TLU, we think that that's a pretty healthy endowment. We draw on that endowment, as all institutions do, are usually in the range of 5 to 6% of a draw that then contributes to our operating budget. So we're pretty similar to what most institutions do, maybe with just some difference in how many zeros there are around all of that. And it makes a difference for us. But as I know one of your previous guests has talked about, it's not just a savings account that you can go to and just run through it and have it fix all of your immediate problems. Because if you do that, well, there are a couple of problems with that. One, most endowments, ours included, have some pretty heavy restrictions on them. So at least half of our endowment is restricted for specific use. So even if we wanted to use it just to solve an immediate problem, we really couldn't. And then the other aspect is thinking about that you're not just managing for today, you're managing for the institution's future. And so you want to keep that endowment so that there's some flexibility to help you for the future. But I mean, the controversies that came up around some of the schools that had huge endowments, but then we're still taking some funding. I think you just at least have to be aware that it's another piece that is not always well understood. And I think it's an individual situation. You know, does an institution with a large endowment need help from the government? They might, or they might not. You know.
Higher ed is a sector, but it's actually very fragmented, as Matt has pointed out in our discussions. Public, private, graduate, undergrad, regional, and then a number of national associations who represent different parts of the sector. And I know, President Cottrell, you're active with the Council of Independent Colleges. Share a little bit about what are the issues that you rely, as a regional university, small regional university, what are the issues that you rely on that association for? Do you talk about pricing? Is DACA an issue there? You know, with other universities, federal support? How do you kind of use that collection in a very fragmented sector?
So the Council of Independent Colleges is a group of institutions that are mostly smaller, and so we have a lot in common. So that helps with the fragmenting. We're not all identical, but we have a lot in common. It's a national organization. And yes, a lot of discussion there, not just about pricing, but about finances in general, about the students we serve, the diversity of students we serve, which is across CIC schools pretty high. How do we serve DACA students? How do we work on the issues that surround that population and other students who don't have the maybe traditional support and resources that we see with other parts of our population. So, and CIC is also very focused on development for people who work at colleges. How do you learn to deal with the issues? And there are a lot of cross connections that the VPs for finance and the VPs for student life all share in their groups within CIC. So it's a great organization that brings a lot of similar schools together. When you look at sort of lobbying issues and where we work to impact the federal government, that's more through the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, NICU, headquartered in DC, which is really working on the federal issues where the government has an impact on what's happening at private independent institutions. And then we all have a state version of that where we work and look at policy issues and do lobbying with our state legislatures to ensure that our sector is represented and not forgotten as policies and funding are being put in place.
Would you say, are you all talking more than usual during this period? Or is everybody
yes.
just sort of has their heads down on sort of their own issues and campuses?
No, I think there's been more conversation than usual, and certainly at the national level, I would say more requests to sign on in support of different efforts so that things can be put in front of Congress people to make them aware of what we're concerned about. Certainly that is always a part of what particularly NICU does, but there's been a compression of that activity in recent months.
Well, President Cottrell, thank you for sharing your perspective and bringing the perspective of small privates into our conversation. Your mission seems more important and more challenging than ever. So best of luck preparing for the fall and leading through this important time. Thank you so much for joining us on HPS Insights.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Appreciate it.
Well, another interesting conversation. A lot there. And, I particularly thought it was interesting to think about, the regional pieces of this conversation as well. Anything stick out in particular to you guys?
To me, and we've heard this from several folks deeply involved in the sector, but the bespoke case-by-case pricing in higher ed is really unlike anything that we've seen in any other good or service. And, I thought President Cottrell did a great job, talking about, how they work with a family or a specific circumstance and have to back out the pricing and the aid particulars. And it's really unique, and I think a pretty underappreciated aspect of how the pricing of higher ed works.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I noted is that, when she was talking about MELT is the phenomenon of people who had committed to attending in the fall, then changing their plans and not attending in the fall, is
Right.
that I think that even while schools are wrestling with the pandemic and trying to address how they provide value to students, how they reopen their campuses, is that there is also a huge recession, and the planning that's done around yield and MELT and enrollment is all based on historicals that are basically out the window at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you have this dimension of like, are more people going to enroll because the job market is bad? If more people enroll, do they need more aid? Are fewer people going to enroll because they can't afford to pay for school? It's very difficult to plan when kind of all the historical priors and all that sort of, data that helps you forecast that stuff are not super helpful in the moment.
And it'll be really interesting to see how sort of the intentions that people, say in that new survey that I referenced, how does that bear out? So they say that this is going to change their plans or cancel their plans, and what happens over the next 3 months, how much of that actually comes true or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic that did not come up with Princeton.
Right.
But I think the reality, as she referenced, is that there's, there are thousands of schools, and they're facing very different dynamics and different demands. And, it's funny to think back just a couple years ago, there was that episode where Virginia Tech missed their yield went way up. So they completely overshot their freshman class, and it was just, it was kind of a mess. It's like, okay, do we put people in hotels? How are we going to do this? So that yield management, that enrollment management process is super, super important. And for schools that don't have functionally, I guess, Princeton has inelastic demand effectively, right? Is that they will not have a problem both filling seats or getting yield or any of that sort of stuff. But that is not the case for the vast majority of schools, and managing that process is really hard.
And I think people would also be really surprised that it's not like if you missed your mark this year, you can over enroll next year. I mean, a lot of these universities are actually governed in the places where they are situated to a very specific enrollment number. So it's a weird dynamic where you actually have, in some cases, a private institution being mandated in enrollment caps by a city when they're, it's just those dynamics come into play big time too. Well, a lot, we could keep talking, and we will on the next episode. So thanks again, guys, for a great conversation. And thanks everybody for listening and joining us on the HPS Insights series on higher ed.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.